this hour. Joining our conversation, U.S. Democratic Congressman Ted Lieu of California. He's a member of the Judiciary and Foreign Affairs Committees. He also served as an impeachment manager at Donald Trump's second Senate impeachment trial. It's tricky, you have to say, which impeachment. Congressman, talk about what today means, seeing the president and vice president on the ground there, meeting with Asian American leaders.
Thank you, Nicole, for your question. I'm very pleased President Biden and Vice President Harris are meeting with Asian American leaders in Georgia. The horrific hate crimes that occurred in Georgia are unacceptable. It's very clear that the murderer targeted women, and these women also happen to be Asian. For those of us in the Asian American community, we're very aware of the rising epidemic of hate crimes and hate incidents against a community. And according to recent reports, in 16 major cities, the rise in hate crimes is nearly 150% in 2020.
Can you just describe the connection between the smear uttered so many times by the former president, we lost track, but repeated this week in an interview on Fox News, describing the coronavirus as the China flu or the Kung flu? What happens after that? What happens after all of his millions of supporters hear that and their frustration and anger builds about the lockdowns or the other challenges of the pandemic? What happens to those kinds of smears?
I was at the House Judiciary Subcommittee hearing on violence against Asian Americans, and we had professors present studies and reports that showed there was a link between the racist rhetoric of the former president and the increase in hate crimes and hate incidents against Asian Americans. When the former president uses terms like Kung flu, racist terms in describing this virus, it gives people more permission to attack Americans who happen to be of Asian descent. I am not a virus, and there is really no evidence whatsoever that Asian Americans somehow transmit this virus more than anybody else. In fact, you're more likely to get the virus if you don't get vaccinated, if you don't wear a mask, and if you don't social distance.
Well, and the largest group of vaccine-hesitant Americans are Trump-supporting males. I want to ask you about something journalist Alex Wagner talked about in the last hour. She's out with a new piece in The Atlantic, and it's called The Asian Spring. And the sort of her premise and what she talked about is really for the first time, she's worried about her mother, who lives in a swing district in Long Island. She's seen sort of these stereotypes of Asians as the model minority, and others have spoken about this all week long. Is this a moment where you're hearing, one, anecdotes of violence against people in your own life that you know, and two, a different view about the importance of speaking out about it?
For many in the Asian American community, none of this is particularly surprising. There has been a history of violence against Asian Americans. Whenever our country feels threatened, unfortunately, sometimes ethnic groups will get scapegoated, including Asian Americans. So you had the whole yellow peril hysteria, followed by the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then you had the internment of Japanese Americans. In the 1980s, when Japan was rising and Americans feared the loss of jobs, Vincent Chin was murdered, and now you have this pandemic. And so for Asian Americans, we are very aware of this history, and we're frankly, many of us are scared and angry right now.
What will the president and vice president hear from this community, which is obviously reeling in the wake of just days after the shooting that targeted 6 Asian women at these day spas? But what do you think the sort of policy changes are? It has to be more than attention. There's new leadership, obviously, at the Justice Department, a new or redoubled commitment to prosecuting hate crimes. But what do you think the community wants to hear from their new president and new vice president?
I think it is a very good step that the President of the United States and the Vice President are meeting with Asian American leaders in Georgia. Last year, I wrote a letter to then Attorney General Bill Barr asking the Department of Justice to do more on hate crimes. That letter was signed by 150 bipartisan members of Congress. Bill Barr ignored the letter. Under the Biden administration, not only have they not ignored the issue of hate crimes, but the president actually issued an executive order to combat hate crimes against Asian Americans. And in the House of Representatives, we have multiple pieces of legislation to strengthen and add additional resources to the hate crimes prosecutions and investigations.
Congressman, do you and people that you know in the Asian community, do you feel threatened walking around the streets or walking around D.C. or walking around your community?
I have told my parents to be more careful. I know a number of Asian Americans do feel more threatened. At the same time, I think it's important to note that the Asian American community is now having a political awakening. We now have more Asian American members of Congress than at any time in U.S. history. According to the U.S. Census, Asian Americans are the fastest increasing group in America. Since 2000, the number of Asian American voters has more than doubled. And according to Pew Research, about 2 years ago, the number of immigrants from the Asia region exceeded immigrants from any other region to the U.S., so this growth is continuing.
It's a really important point to end on. Congressman Ted Lieu, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Eugene and Sam are sticking